This is an important moment in time to have a debate about masculinity. We've seen over the last year or two, to use a phrase that David Laser used in his recent book, Women, Men, and the Whole Damn Thing, female fury with the Me Too movement, where totally unacceptable and abhorrent behavior was exposed in people, in men who were in incredibly powerful positions. Some people have feel that the Me Too movement has gone too far. But what's typified by this debate is fear. Fear on the part of men and fear on the part of women. And the debate has not been that constructive. And so this is a time where we can actually look at some of the important issues with people who have thought them through. And I just want to reflect that progress over the last century and a half has largely been the result of women's progress. It's not commonly known. It's a commonplace thing that women live longer than men. But actually, women living longer than men is a very recent phenomenon. For most of human history, men have lived longer than women. And that changed in the mid-19th century when these patriarchal obstetricians forced doctors to wash their hands, and the birth of modern obstetrics. And women survived childbirth, babies survived childbirth, and then it was over for all us men. There's also a phenomenon, I just want to be a little bit, because you can illustrate some of the force and where some of this has come from by looking at the history here. We tend to think, when you look at health, that smoking causes cancer, and we know about cholesterol and so on. And there's always been a debate between the curative doctors and the preventive doctors about who wins. And after the Second World War, they noticed that tuberculosis was declining. And so the curative doctors said triumphantly, we were right all along, that's the antibiotics we've introduced, that's cured tuberculosis. And the preventive people said, no, you're bullshitting, it's what we did in the 19th century, better housing, better nutrition, and if you draw the graph of tuberculosis, you won't be able to tell where antibiotics were introduced. It was a straight line. An Australian historian working with a German historian said, you're both wrong. And they looked at parishes in Europe, side by side, just as poor, just as exposed to famine, just as bad housing, and yet some communities, side by side, did not seem to get tuberculosis at the same rate as the other. And they looked for what was the factor that correlated. The villages that taught girls to read and write lived longer and were less likely to get tuberculosis. This is not some Marxist-Leninist pinko conspiracy. This is a solid foundation for public health. When you improved female literacy, the world changed. Women got more power, wealth went up in families. And let me tell you, ISIS know this and the Taliban know this. That's why little girls get murdered going to school, and they blow up schools that teach girls to read and write. So we are in an environment where largely, to a very great extent, women's progress has been progress for us all, for men as well. But we come to this juncture where we'd hoped a few years ago that things were a lot better, and yet they don't seem to be at all. So let's have a debate about it. Our first speaker is Zac Seidler, who's a men's health advocate, a psychologist, a researcher at Origin, which is the youth mental health service in Victoria, and he's also director of professional training at Movember, trying to seek better mental health outcomes and reduce male suicide rates. Please welcome Zac Seidler.
It was a warm Sydney day late last year when, let's call him Sam, walked into my office. Sam was in his late teens, 6'3", and with a vice grip handshake that, as I joked with him, would put Donald Trump to shame. I've been in therapy with Sam for almost a month now, and I'm yet to get much more out of him than a couple of wry smiles, monosyllabic responses, unless we talk about surfing, in which case his eyes light up. But today, something's different. Today, Sam was averting my gaze. He looked exhausted, his leg was shaking, and he was rubbing his hands together uncontrollably as if they might fall off. For a guy that seemed unfazed by anything, suddenly he's a ball of nerves. I could feel the pressure in every word he uttered, as if his life depended on it. I could see him physically fighting against everything he had been taught, everything that had been reinforced in him, as he stood at a literal precipice. I waited, and then the silence overwhelmed him, and he began to weep. The dam of male feeling that runs through us men had broken in him, and there was no going back. Sam then slowly told me he had tried to kill himself the night before. He'd been feeling hopeless for as long as he could remember, but for some reason I was the first to hear of this. He cried because he desperately wanted to live, but couldn't see a way to navigate through this pain while maintaining the mask that he had come to rely on. You see, Sam had worked tirelessly for years at cultivating and tending to an image of resilience and silent stoicism and emotional strength, an image that had been sold to him by society. He thought he had everyone fooled. Turns out no one was even watching. It was not the fragility of Sam's masculinity that led him to attempt to take his own life. Rather, it was that he would not or could not admit to and own this fragility. You see, despite what media taglines might have you think, it is not fragile masculinity that is killing men by suicide or in high-speed car crashes. It is not what is starting wars, fuels a coward punch, or what catcalls women at night. It is the purposeful suppression of this innate fragility that we all have, the denial and outright avoidance that wreaks havoc on men, women, and our communities. You see, guys like Sam are afraid to be fragile, to be vulnerable, so instead they often resort to violence, substance misuse, and risk-taking as ways to counteract that niggling feeling that they are in some way weak or flawed. Suddenly, the fact that men die on average 4 years younger than women in this country comes into clear view. But Sam's is a single story replicated over thousands of times every week across Australia, and I'm sure you've all been touched by a similar story. But it's not merely anecdotal, as researchers for the past 3 or 4 decades have been trying to understand how and why this takes place. In several studies conducted by US-based researcher Joseph Vanderlo, men were randomly assigned to either braid hair, considered a potential challenge to their masculinity, you can decide whether or not that's true, or to tie knots in a rope. The hair braiders, they were then given the option of either solving a puzzle or punching a bag. The hair braiders overwhelmingly chose to punch. And when all men were forced to punch the bag, the hair braiders on average punched much, much harder in what was labeled a manhood-restoring tactic. Masculinity is a problematic, anxious state that is hard-won and easily lost. Men like Sam are often in a destructive cycle because the more they deny their vulnerability, their pain, physical or psychological, the more fragile and uncertain their life becomes, and the more intolerable this feels. When men's thoughts and feelings fester and remain unchallenged, stifled by fear, they calcify. And what follows are I would call them, often detached, trigger-happy and confused behaviors that we see splashed across our front pages. Masculinity has become, over time, sold to these men as a one-size-fits-all way of being, and is now a tool for oppression, for repression, and now for depression. Men are powerfully concerned about how they are perceived in others' eyes, but we are those eyes. It's about time we rebrand and embrace the fragile as beautiful, as intricate, as complex, because that's what masculinity is. No longer can it be used as an insult leveled at these thugs and rapists that haunt the Hollywood Hills or that tweet their way through the White House halls. It is these men's utter disconnection from their own fallibility that spells disaster. We only continue to be complicit in a patriarchal weaponizing of the word when we describe morally vapid and unstable men as fragile. I'm so privileged in my work as a clinical psychologist to see the beauty and the beast of masculinity, the mateship and misogyny, on full, uncensored display as they coalesce and contradict one another. It's this uncertainty about how to move through the world that we should promote and seek to help men navigate as they learn to understand their identity as they grow. We need to open up, not shut down lines of communication early in our boys so that they know that they can admit that sometimes they've got no bloody idea what they're doing. They don't know why they threw that punch. They don't know why they cracked that joke. If we make clear that men can ask questions and won't be shamed, especially by other men, that we won't strip them of man cards, but in fact they might gain a few, well, then we can avoid the restrictive stubbornness we see so often in guys like Sam, born out of fear that they've failed, that they haven't measured up. So once Sam finally opened up, we began on the long road to recovery. Because once you admit you're fragile, you realize you deserve love and compassion and care to stop yourself from shattering. At the end of our time together, Sam gave me the suicide note he had written that day. As so often happens, he asked me to share it with the other guys that sat in that same chair. When he left, I looked down and noticed on the back of the letter, Sam had scrawled in red ink, "Take off the mask. I promise you'll be able to breathe easier." Sam is thankfully still here, but plenty of men are not. If only they'd known and embraced how truly fragile they were rather than expending endless energy railing against it. Many more boys would have their fathers, parents their sons, and wives their husbands. We must treat men delicately, tenderly, and with compassion. We should all model wearing our fragility with pride so that young guys growing up in the world don't see it as a marker of shame, but one that just might save their life. So, in closing, masculinity. How fragile is it? The more fragile, the better, I say. Thank you.
Clearly there's a Zack Seidler cheer squad somewhere in the room. Our first speaker against the motion is Raewyn Connell. Raewyn Connell is a leading social scientist. She's retired from her academic life, but not retired from life or writing. Her book this year is called The Good University. She's active in the peace movement, the labour movement, and for gender equality. Please welcome Raewyn Connell.
Thank you. I think all of us on the platform are more or less agreed that we will only get somewhere with this topic if we get beyond the conventions of the old battle of the sexes, men against women, in some eternal opposition. And I'm very happy to admit that some of my best friends are men. I'm pretty confident about that. And that matters because when you get into the subject in any depth, you realize that gender is about relationships. Gender is always interactive. And what happens in men's lives matters in women's lives and vice versa. So I'm very happy to start by agreeing with Zac about the vulnerabilities of men and in men's lives. Some years back, I was one of a team which produced a review of research on men's health for our federal government. So I'm familiar with the statistics about the greater prevalence among men of certain forms of mental illness, greater vulnerability to coronary heart disease, greater prevalence among men of occupational injuries, much greater in fact, the higher proportion among men of completed suicides, and although this wasn't part of our review, the much higher representation of men among the casualties of military and paramilitary action. Now, why these kinds of statistical differences? Is it because men have weaker bodies than women? Don't think so. Is it because men are afflicted by raging hormones, perhaps? I don't think so either. When we get into these issues, that's when we have to talk about masculinity or masculinities. And by masculinity, as you'll find if you read my excellent book on the subject, that masculinities are basically patterns of action and belief, things people do and configurations of things that people do in relation to where they sit, where they live their lives in the overall gender order of the society. There's a good deal now of research on masculinities around the world. It's quite a flourishing field of research, and one of the crucial findings of all that research is that masculinity does not exist. There are multiple masculinities, plural, in just about every setting where this kind of research has been done. And some of them, however, have more centrality, more prestige, more centrality in the culture. In our society, I think there's not much question that the most honoured, the most central, most influential patterns of masculinity are those with links to power, social power of some form or another, whether it's physical power, whether it's organisational power. We live in a corporate world, and it's not surprising then that arguably the most influential, the most central form of masculinity in our society is the patterns associated with corporate power. It's then no surprise that when the survey is done of the chief executives of the Fortune 500 companies, the largest companies in the global economy, and that's done every year, it's monitored every year by the magazine Fortune. Currently, the latest round of that, of the chief executives of the biggest 500 companies in the world, some 93% of the chief executives were men. Now, if that was a statistic taken to the ACCC, I think they would say that is close to being a monopoly. It is a masculinized culture at the top of the corporate system. I've done a certain amount of research with corporate masculinities, managerial masculinities, especially we were interested in the finance industry, which is not a strongly, macho physical industry, but is unquestionably extremely powerful. And the top guns in the financial corporations that we were looking at do share a certain pattern of masculinity, one which is marked by confidence, by intense focus on the job, and ruthlessness in the pursuit of the corporation's interests, which can be summed up principally as profit. But that is not the only kind of masculinity that you find in financial corporations. I remember, for instance, an interview that we did with a younger executive, middle level of one of Australia's major banks, whom we call in the research report Simon. An interesting youngish man who, with his wife, had just had their first child, a young boy. Now, the pattern among his seniors in the corporation was to leave all that kind of business to the women. Their masculinity depended on women's labour in the home. Simon wasn't buying that. A young man, he was influenced by some of the debates around masculinity, and he felt that his connection with his young son depended on his being present actually physically present in the life of his son. So he had made a practice of, in his working day, of leaving the office at 4:30 in the afternoon, going home and spending real time doing childcare. The problem was, of course, that was the end of his prospects of promotion in the mainstream corporate, in this mainstream pattern of corporate masculinity. None of his seniors would do that, and none of them would think very much of a young executive who had, in their eyes, such a limited commitment to the job. So that's the kind of thing that causes me to be concerned about the integration, the interplay, if you like, between corporate power and the lives of the men who actually exercise that power. And if we're thinking about corporate or organisational masculinities, the kinds of masculinities that predominate at the elite levels of organisational life, then I have to say the term fragile does not come to mind. The last time I looked, corporate capitalism was still there, despite the global financial crisis, the mounting crisis of climate change, and the Me Too movement, still solidly in place. If we look at our mass media, turn on the television if that's the way you access your audiovisual life, and you'll see a lot of the content consists of displays of masculinity of one form or another. One, perhaps the most widely watched, being the vision of a number of ultra-fit young men bumping into each other on screen. If we move across from football to religion, well, as far as I know, the Pope is still a man, and the Archbishop of Sydney, the Anglican Archbishop, has recently invited gays and trans men and such like creatures to depart from his church. If we look at the realm of government, well, the survey, the latest figures on that from last year, 93% of heads of government in the world are men. Well, these kinds of masculinities have been under challenge, but we are now seeing a new backlash, a new reassertion of dominating forms of masculinity in the form of authoritarian masculinities, authoritarian nationalism, the masculine revenge in person. And you can supply the names as easily as I can. So dominant forms of masculinity, it seems to me, are still entrenched with toxic effects for many men and for almost all women.
Very good.
Thank you, Raewyn. Our second speaker for the motion is David Laser. David is a prominent and well-respected journalist, having worked most of his life for Fairfax. But this year really blew open this debate with a book that's had an enormous impact. The book's called Women, Men, and the Whole Damn Thing, and provoked by the Me Too movement. Please welcome David Laser.
I want to start with the word fragile. The fact that we live means we also know we're going to die. And all around us, every day, we have reminders of that stark truth. Heartbreaking deaths, shocking deaths, accidental deaths, death by one's own hand. So we are all vulnerable for the simple reason that none of us knows the hour of our passing. None of us knows when a call might come that will tell us of a diagnosis or the loss of a loved one, a call that will utterly change our lives forever. Masculinity, on the other hand, is a concept that concerns the characteristics of men, and that in and of itself is not fragile. What is fragile, and why I'm arguing that it is today, is that the models of manhood that we've been presented with are only a part of who we are, and therefore tenuous and easily breakable. The models of manhood we've been given can often look like strength and power, but they are models that rob once sweet, innocent boys of their emotions and remove men from their hearts, leaving them feeling isolated and vulnerable and often prone to violent and abusive behaviour. The Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung gave us a useful framework for understanding this more than 100 years ago. He believed we're all born with archetypal feminine and masculine qualities. He called the archetypal qualities the anima, qualities of tenderness, compassion, vulnerability, relatedness, creativity, intuition. He called the archetypal masculine qualities animus, qualities of courage, assertiveness, analytical thought, reason, logic, a drive for achievement. All of us carry these qualities inside us from birth, and at best, these qualities are supposed to work together to create an authentic, balanced wholeness. Trouble is, we've created gender identities and roles from childhood that conform to often crippling sexual stereotypes. Girls wear pink, and isn't that pretty? Boys wear blue and play with trucks, and aren't you strong? For men, these stereotypes are particularly destructive because men are taught to be tough, to be courageous, to be dominating, to not feel pain, for goodness sake, to not act like a girl, to not display emotion, except of course anger, and to not show fear. That's fragile masculinity, not healthy masculinity. Because as Australian writer Tim Winton said, you start out with all the colours in the pencil box as a child, and then somehow you get to middle age, and all you've got left in the pencil box is black, purple, and dark blue. There's your colours, go live a life with that. Healthy masculinity is the full colour spectrum. It enables a man to treat women and girls with the same kindness and respect with which he would like to be treated. It enables a man to advocate for women and men. It enables a man to nurture friendships and to enjoy the company and affection of other men without feeling like his manhood is under threat. It allows a man to be honest with himself about his feelings, needs, desires, and it prevents a man from using his size and power to lord it over others. But it's hard to know how to be a healthy man if you've grown up with the mask and all the insecurities concealed behind the mask, where the fear of being seen as weak cripples you psychically and severs you from many of your natural human emotions. You live with the peer pressure to objectify and denigrate girls to prove your manhood, under threat of ridicule or violence from other men. You spend hours each day watching porn, playing video games, having your brain rewired in the opposite direction of connection and intimacy. You follow the rituals of power and the bristling hostility and pecking order that men impose on each other. That's the man box. We often hear about it. And Tony Porter, the American educator, spoke of it in his TED talk a few years ago when he described how his little daughter Jay used to come crying to him anytime she liked. And Porter would comfort her saying, "Daddy's got you." With his son Kendall, the opposite was true. Whenever he heard him cry, his son had about 30 seconds to stop before he'd start saying to him, "Why are you crying? Hold your head up. Look at me. Explain to me what's wrong." And then just go to your room, go to your room, sit down, get yourself together, and come back and talk to me when you can talk to me like a man. His son was 5 years old. This denial of tenderness and vulnerability is deeply imbued in men, and it's learnt first in childhood and reinforced in the schoolyard, then burnished bright with posture and swagger in sporting clubs, universities, the military, corporate boardrooms. Many boys are taught early that to avoid the bullies, they have to side with them. They trash talk the girls because, heaven forbid, they might like one themselves and be labelled weak. Never mind what they really feel, putting their hearts on the line carries too many risks. This fear of expressing emotion, of being seen as weak or vulnerable, keeps boys and men paralysed, because in fighting to live up to the tyranny of masculinity, men become driven to do anything to prove they are neither weak, nor tender, nor insecure. I believe this is at the heart of so much men's rage, whether expressed through murder, rape, domestic violence, suicide, alcoholism, reckless driving, or simply sullen withdrawal from the world. It's one of the reasons that the greatest violence on the planet today is violence against women. The greatest violence on the planet, with more than 1 billion being raped or beaten in their lifetime. It is why in Australia more than 1.2 million adult women experience an incidence of sexual violence from the age of 15, and more than one woman every week is killed by a current or former partner. And it is why in Australia we have a national emergency of up to 6 men a day taking their own lives. This is what happens when the beckoning archway of human need for closeness and love gets bricked up, brick by hurtful brick, through these crippling models of manhood. So if men attack or are in conflict with women in the outer world, it's because there is a conflict within their own inner world, within their own psyches. They are at war with themselves, and that is inherently both a perilous and fragile thing. What we see all around us today is a masculinity that comes from a wounded place, because it is based on fear. The fear of losing power, of getting in touch with feelings long since buried, of not being able to be fully oneself, of being swallowed up by emotions you can't control. This is quite possibly the first act of violence that the patriarchy commits, the wholesale assault on the qualities of softness and vulnerability, of emotional attachment that resides inside a man. If any further proof were needed, I give you Exhibit A, the trumped-up version of masculinity currently residing in the White House. A man with a bottomless hunger for acknowledgement, power, and flattery. A man whose cruelty, narcissism, and contempt for women is unlike anything we've ever seen from an American president. A man who pretends to be a man, but who is rather a tantrum-throwing child who never grew up. A boy man who is powerful and dangerous, yes, but who is endlessly mocked, utterly alone, and when you get behind his ego-fueled strutting, is fragile to his very core. He is, in fact, the defining example in the world today of fragile masculinity. Thank you.
I wondered when the Donald would come up. Our final speaker and our second speaker against the motion is Catharine Lumby, who's Professor of Media at Macquarie University. She was founding Professor of Media Centres and Research Groups at both the University of New South Wales and the University of Sydney. She's worked on masculinity and the issues related to masculinity at Google Australia, National Rugby League, and whose problems have been well known. She sits on the board of Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia, and really coming to the heart of masculinity, she's writing a biography of Frank Moorhouse. Please welcome Catharine Lumby.
Thank you, Simon. Good old, red-blooded, fair dinkum, true blue Aussie blokes. Where do I start? Now, my colleagues on this side of the stage have made persuasive and erudite arguments for the proposition that some men are fragile. No argument from me there. And I agree with everything they've said about male vulnerability. But masculinity? Masculinity, I submit to you, is a different proposition. And sure, it's a set of attributes that vary with time and culture, but in contemporary Australia, dominant ideas of masculinity are still alive and well. They are robust. They are associated with assertiveness, leadership, and a well-developed capacity for ignoring emotions, and women who speak up in meetings. Despite the wonderful diversity of men, the default setting for masculinity in Australia remains the straight white bloke. Take a look at Parliament, the corporate sector, talkback radio, sport, religion, the academy, surgery, the law. I could go on. Who is in charge? A surfeit of white blokes. If masculinity is really so fragile, then answer me this. Why are men still running the joint? And why are women accused of destroying the joint, to quote Alan Jones, when a few of them defy the odds and take positions normally occupied by men? Now, I agree that humans are fragile, and being human is a messy business. I should know, I've raised 2 kids, and ask any woman who's ever gone to a meeting with Weet-Bix in her hair. There are definitely men who are put in a fragile position socially because they don't live up to the dominant white masculine norms. Queer men, trans men, men of colour, men who are creative, men who listen, even to women in meetings. They are the men I adore, and they are my friends, and I am so lucky to have men like that in my life. Men who don't have a problem with not fitting the dominant masculine stereotype. But unfortunately, we are still living in a society where dominant masculinity is not fragile enough. So Zac and I are agreeing on that. Where Eddie Maguire, president of the AFL Collingwood Football Club, games show host, and celebrity for reasons that remain unclear to me, gets away with threatening to drown a senior female sports reporter. Let me be specific. In what the AFL described as a light-hearted moment, he suggested age reporter Caroline Wilson be dunked in an ice bath and made to stay under. Now, obviously, this talk of drowning women in ice baths is just a bit of fun. It's not like any red-blooded Aussie bloke would ever seriously contemplate hurting a woman. It's not like we've got an epidemic of domestic violence in this country or anything. Though clearly we do have a plague of politically correct joke police who are hell-bent on taking those comments the wrong way. Which brings me to the problem of the rising tide of men who claim they are under attack from feminism. And this is to pick up on Raewyn's point here. And that it's white guys who are the real victims in this world. There is a real backlash going on, and that's the claim that's made. Now, in recent years, Mark Latham has given us some truly spectacular displays of that syndrome. He's on record referring to Wendy Harmer, a woman who broke ground in stand-up comedy, radio and television for all women, as a commercial failure and a disabled woman because Wendy happened to be born with a cleft palate. And then there are Latham's vile attacks on former Australian of the Year and domestic violence survivor Rosie Batty, which culminated in his claim that men resort to family violence as a coping mechanism. Now, of course, it could be argued that Latham's extraordinary outbursts are a sign of underlying fragility. And I agree about Trump. The same case could be made for that other infamously unhinged politician, Donald Trump. But what this argument ignores is that both men have been handsomely rewarded for their boorish displays of dominant masculinity. They are prone to playing the victim, but they have been making those claims while sucking all the oxygen out of the room for years. What men who exhibit dominant masculine traits tend to have in common is that they regard any attempts to limit their dominance as a breach of their human right to power. They aren't fragile at all. On the contrary, they're extremely powerful and they don't want to share that power with anyone else, including men who don't fit that stereotype. Just check the statistics. and we've already heard quite a bit about this, 1 woman a week is killed in this country by an intimate partner. Are we supposed to see the men who perpetrate this violence as victims of masculine norms? Sure, when it comes to prevention, we need to start young, educating boys about the damage that the straitjacket of masculinity can do to them as well as to others. And I know Zac is a strong supporter of that position. But by the time dominant masculinity has progressed to the point of being expressed in family violence, I don't think masculine fragility is the issue we should be focusing on. Last year, I conducted research for an SBS documentary titled Is Australia Sexist? We surveyed over 3,000 Australian men and women. Young women, what shocked me is how little has changed. Young women are still routinely being catcalled in the street and harassed in the workplace. The gender pay gap is still at 14%. 62% of people think that some jobs are better suited to men, like maths and sciences. And despite this reality, over 40% of men and women still thought feminism had gone too far. I don't know what that means. We were heading for Brisbane and we ended up in Darwin. So in summary, let me leave you with this thought. Men's health and psychological problems matter. And not all men are the same, but as a society we still have a huge problem with the toxic effects of dominant masculinity. Far from being fragile, it has proven remarkably robust. And men who define themselves by dominant masculinity remain extremely adept at clinging on to the lion's share of power. Thank you.
Well done. Good catch.
And we need to hear the pre-poll results. Rebecca, do we have them? I'll just check. Yep. Thanks, Rebecca. So here's what you said on the way in. 50% of you agreed that masculinity is fragile. 22% of you were undecided. And 28% thought that men weren't fragile at all. So as they say with the posters, there's room for maneuver here before the end of the debate. So while we're putting out the microphones for you to come up and ask questions, and if you just hold on a second, I got the sense from all of you that fragility is not a problem. Zac?
That what's not a problem?
Fragility, male fragility, is not a problem.
It's not a problem. It's something that's very difficult to conjure up in men, though, I think. And we should be supporting and promoting it. But it's definitely not something to be shied away from, by any means.
Raewyn? Is it a problem?
It's a problem at the individual level, I think, in some men's lives. I don't have any doubt about that. It's at the level of the whole society, I guess, that fragility seems to vanish from the picture and is hardly, how you would characterise our gender system.
So, David, if we were to open up this fragility, what would happen? Well, first of all, how would we open it up further than it has, and what would happen? What's the opportunity or the risk?
Well, I mean, there's a problem with the word fragility to start with. I mean, so let me say that because, like I said at the outset of my talk, we're all fragile, we're all vulnerable, we're all perishable, breakable. So in that sense, we're all afflicted, but that's what it means to be alive. But where we could open this up is, one of the things about men that all of the surveys, that what's the most defining aspect of being a man, and it's not whether you're tall, dark and good looking, or you've got, great pecs, or your sexual prowess, it's your role as a provider. The Yankovic survey in America has time and again concluded that men identify with their role as a provider, obviously if they're in a family situation. So if the social and economic forces shift under your feet and you can't talk about that, you can't go to the places that hurt, then you're in trouble. And if you add to that the fact that we've been acculturated, we've been socialised as men, as boys, not to be able to talk about our emotions, then we're in double trouble.
So, Catherine, power relationships don't seem to have changed. We're having the same discussion again and again, and we hear about domestic violence, the Me Too movement. How do we move beyond this debate?
Well, I mean, it's complex, and I think what Raewyn just said is important, and this is the distinction between the arguments, I think, is that we're talking about patriarchy, a kind of structural framework for masculinity, for dominant masculinity, but acknowledging that, of course, on the individual level, men are fragile. So how do we move beyond it? Well, I think we start young. And this is something that Zac argues and I argue, is that we start very young looking at the very gendered nature of our society and working with boys and girls in primary school upwards to get them to question this kind of dominant gendered framework. And the fact that, look, you know, if I'm being real about this, I've always thought feminism benefits men as much as women. I think it's terrible that some men feel that they can't be child carers, that they feel that their options are limited, that their life choices are limited. I think we all benefit if we have a more holistic approach to who we are as humans.
Surely, though, if we're saying that...
Just before you say that, please come up now. There are microphones here, 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 and here, and if you want to make a comment or ask a question.
If we're saying that masculinity on the whole, from a structural perspective, is not fragile, that's such a pessimistic view, because that's saying that there's no room to move. You're implying that dominance is locked one way or another.
No, I'm not.
Fragility means that there is vulnerability, that there is ability for flux and change, does it not?
Yeah. I mean, of course there's room to move, but I think we've got to begin by acknowledging how instantiated it is structurally, these power relations.
Several of you talked about denial. What are we denying here exactly, David?
The acoustics don't come back here, so hear very well. Can you
several of you spoke about denial.
Yeah.
What are the core things that we are denying in this debate?
What are the core things we're denying in this debate? I'm not sure if we're denying anything in this debate. We're trying to actually open up the debate. I mean, I'm curious that the patriarchy... I mean, I think we all agree on this panel of the damage that the patriarchy does. We all know that we live in a hyper-masculinist world that has... I mean, I go back to the Jungian kind of paradigm of the masculine and feminine. We have desecrated the feminine. Our relationship to the earth is the primary example of how we have failed to live in harmony with the planet. And what men have done to women and other men and children, which is abuse and coerce and control, is exactly what we've done to the earth. So we live in denial of the other part of our natural, gifted, bequeathed selves, which is our feminine. And that's what I would argue for.
Yes, number 4.
Is this working?
It will work.
All right. Oh, okay. Hi. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. But I've always considered the idea that, that not being masculine is threatening to men because it involves being feminine, and femininity and womanhood in general is considered to be humiliating, gay, you know, all those sorts of things, like the idea of being weak, etc. So I always kind of considered it indirect, like a direct result of the, I guess you could say, oppression of women in that sense. So I just wondered if you guys agreed with that or not, because I didn't hear any mention of masculinity being considered the opposite to femininity.
A fear of femininity. Raewyn, want to comment?
Yes, I think you're entirely right that masculinity always exists in relationship to femininity. or put the plural of both patterns of masculinity exist in relationship to patterns of femininity. So we can define a dominant form of masculinity. We can also define an exaggerated form of femininity that sort of connects or mirrors, or in a negative way, that pattern. Sorry, carry on. Yes, go on.
Zac, do you think that was going through Sam's mind when he was going through his agony and his pain?
For sure, I would say that in many men's eyes, as when we look at dominant masculinity, it is cast in direct opposition to femininity. The fear of the feminine is often the way that men choose to act by turning away from it and, using all of these oppressive and violent behaviours for fear of in any way being perceived as weak. So I think if we are to really change this whole gender politics debate, the, empowerment of women is only going to do good things for men, because they're not going to fear that vulnerability which is linked with femininity, I guess.
So, do you agree with that proposition that there's work to be done, Catharine, on the image of femininity in a sense?
Oh, absolutely, and I think that, this is the point that Raewyn was making too, is that when I was making about dominant masculinity, because there are masculinities, but I think what we're really here to talk about is the sort of structural dominance of a particular kind of masculinity, which is, that's why I said white men, and I know I'm really generalising there, and I'm not having a go at all white men, but that is the model against which everything else is judged: gender, sexuality, race, all of these things. That's the kind of pole
it's not
against
just white men. There are men of colour who are pretty horrible to women too.
Oh, no, I'm not doubting that, but what I'm saying is that men of colour will, in a way, are relationally positioned against whiteness. So there's an intersectionality to the way in which people are positioned.
Yes, microphone number 2.
Hi. I actually had kind of a similar point to the previous question, but when you were kind of saying men might tell their son don't act like a girl, don't cry, when then to their female child say the opposite. It's the same point. There seems to be this ingrained opinion of society that it's bad to be a woman or bad to show emotion or anything like that. And I feel like the same is almost taught to girls as they get older, maybe not when they're young. When they're young, they're allowed to have tantrums and cry. But as you become a woman, you're told not to be emotional because then people won't take you seriously. You're told not to show anything. You're told very similar things. It's a man's world, and if you want to survive, you have to show that masculinity, whether not necessarily in the way you dress or anything, but in the way you present yourself and the way you give your opinions and stuff like that. So is it maybe not so much a question of whether men's masculinity is fragile or femininity is fragile? It's just as human beings, we've decided emotion is fragility, and we haven't allowed space in our society for people to be emotional and to express it on both sides of the gender. It's not so much a problem, obviously it's a strong problem for men, but it's more a societal problem.
That is the dominant law. Very good point. Any comment?
It's a great question.
Great point.
And I totally agree with you. And, why are women who get emotional called shrill or hysterical? I mean, hysterical comes from the word hyster, Hyster, which comes from the word for womb, the Greek word for womb. So it's actually in the language framed by men that would call someone hysterical because they express their emotions. But it's still coming from the same place. It's still coming from this culture that is hyper-masculinist, which seeks to kind of bleed out the heart of who we are. And we're in competition with each other. We're not collaborating with each other. So for boys, it's you don't show your tenderness and vulnerability because that's unmanly. For women, don't show that you're emotional. But who's deciding this? It's this dominant masculine framework that we're all living under.
Catherine, you're working for footballers, and you now frequently see footballers crying on television. You see cricketers crying on television. These false tears?
No. I mean, I think one of the problems is that emotion, or anything that's seen as messy or vulnerable, is associated with the feminine. Now, there is a space where we can see the kind of stereotype I was referring to, a bit tongue-in-cheek, the fair dinkum Aussie bloke, crying and showing emotion, hugging people, jumping up and down and screaming. Well, that's the sporting field and working as a spectator on a sports stadium. That's a sanctioned space for male emotion. But the idea is, I mean, this really goes back to the way in which women are seen as belonging to the private sphere, as messy. Their bodies are seen as, as not contained properly. And part of that is also the idea that women are overly emotional. And I think it's the suppression of the feminine, yes, but it's also because to be masculine, you've got to kind of reject the feminine. So there's a kind of prejudicial framework for understanding the feminine.
Now, just to let you know that our volunteers are coming through with the boxes to take your votes and see whether the undecided have moved. Have a think about this, and the boxes are coming round. We're doing this a little bit early because we're going to count 1,000 people's votes before we get the result. Yes, microphone number 1. You might want to angle the microphone a little bit, yes.
Hi. Hello. Hi. So first of all, I have a comment, and then I have a question. So the first comment I have is that I was very surprised to actually see 2 men and 2 women. I actually wanted to see a woman talking about male fragility, and I wanted to see a man talking on this side as well. So that's my first comment. I was surprised by that. I would have liked to have seen a woman standing up for male fragility. And I guess my question is, what is the role of women in propagating the role of masculinity as it stands right now? What is the role of women in actually encouraging men to behave like men?
Well,
we'll ask our token women.
Yes. Women are, as I was saying earlier on, gender is interactive. And given that women are central in the growing up experiences of most boys and men, yes, women have a large role in the creation of patterns of masculinity, or share in that process. It's not transmitted, by some mysterious divine fluid from the head of the father to the head of the son. It is an interactive process, but that also means, that there are complexities that can come in and contradictions, which is why a lot of men do feel uncomfortable in the dominant patterns, do, break out on occasion from conventional patterns, and why people like my young bank executive can actually sometimes move in a different direction.
So is this a job you want, Catherine?
I'm sorry?
Is this a job you want then, Catherine, arguing for men?
Well, actually, I've got to say, because it's a debate, one of the things we've all discussed is the debate's a pretty contrived setting. If we were all sitting on a panel, which I think would be an alternative format and one I'd probably be more comfortable with, I think you would see much more fluidity in the way that we were talking about these issues.
In other words, we actually could have put Catherine on the other side.
I could argue that side. I could easily have argued that side. Yeah.
But it's a very good point. Thank you very much indeed. Yes. Now back for number 3.
We heard before about learnings which we have to have. One of the statistics which came out before was that of the top 500 Fortune 500 companies, 93% are male CEOs. That's horrific, but that's really scary for the future. But if we look at Australia, if we look at our board composition, there's been a slight improvement there. However, if we look at the top 10 Australian companies, and I'm happy to be corrected here, there is not one female CEO. But where my question comes in is that you spoke about financial services before. In financial services, we are one of the few countries in the world that has had a female CEO of one of the leading banks. However, if we look at the composition of her direct reports, so her N-1, originally there were 2 female direct reports. At the end of her tenure, I think there was 0. There may have been 1, which was HR. Is this then a problem that we have, that where females rise to the top, and in the organisation which Mrs. Kelly was at, it was a great organisation. However, when you end up at the N-1 level, 1 or 0 female direct reports, does that mean that there is sometimes a problem with females not allowing that glass ceiling to be broken for their direct reports? And whilst you mightn't like the question, it's a fact.
Factual purposes, the Macquarie Bank is now run by a woman, but I'm not sure what the next level down is. Do you want to comment on this, Catherine?
Yeah, just briefly. If you're suggesting that it's a syndrome of women pulling up the drawbridge, I don't deny that there might be individual women who've behaved in that way, but I come back to the fact that the problem is structural. Okay, so when you're looking at the pool of people that are available to recruit into that level and who've been mentored and promoted to that position, we don't have a problem with supply of women, but we have a structural problem with what happens to women when they enter the workforce, if they're the primary carers for children. There's a set of structural cultural issues which are, which can be addressed. And I think that that's what we should be looking at, not individual women and saying, well, obviously they're not promoting women, they're just as bad as men.
Microphone number 4.
First of all, I'd like to frame this question within the context of violence and evil, because I do think it's a subject that is tiptoed around a bit too much. We're taught that violence is the exception rather than the rule. Well, history would disagree. In the 20th century alone, we had the rape of Nanking, the rape of Berlin, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and over a dozen separate genocides. History has shown that violence is the rule rather than the exception. Second, I'd like to establish that women fighting like men is a complete fabrication. There's a few women who can fight like men, but generally speaking, they're few and far between. As a whole, women cannot protect themselves from violence in the way that men can, and to even suggest otherwise is delusional. My question is, how is it not completely hypocritical and borderline delusional to even suggest that masculinity is fragile, when right now, at this exact moment, we're living in what is historically a utopia in comparison to the medieval ages, for example, which was brought about exclusively by the suffering and sacrifice of men on the battlefield?
David?
Thanks for your question. Herodotus.
Come on, speak the truth.
Herodotus,
speak the truth now.
The Greek historian documented female warriors in ancient Libya and Ethiopia who were every bit as qualified and skilled fighters as men. I was in Israel last year. If you actually investigate the quality of the fighters amongst female Israeli soldiers, they are every bit as good as men. I don't buy the argument that women.
But you accept women's vulnerability in the domestic situation?
Well, yeah, but there's also statistics that show that in lesbian relationships there is a great deal of, there can be violence as well. It's not only man to woman. There are women who are stronger than men, but the point being that women have been prevented from occupying a lot of occupations that had nothing to do with their physical power. They have been prevented from entering the law and government and politics for centuries, and being able to vote that had nothing to do with their physical power. So I'm not sure that physical power is necessarily the criteria on which I would judge equality.
Zac?
Firstly, I don't know if you've seen Gal Gadot in Superwoman, but you should check that out because she's damn strong. But putting that aside, I think this is the exact framing of the issue, which is to say that we're talking about fragility And I respect the question, but we immediately go to strength. We immediately shift this, we turn it on its head, as men often, and we are shying away, as much as we shy away from violence, and I agree with that one way or another, we are shying away from the proposition here, which is fragility, not strength. We're trying to look at what are the, the structural ramifications that lead to men being very worried about showing that fragility in public or elsewhere. And I think that we are so comfortable shifting that on its head and talking about strength instead.
Yes. Microphone number 2.
At the beginning, someone mentioned medical professionals and scientists arguing over whether remedy or prevention was more effective. And so far, there seems to be a consensus that prevention is more effective in avoiding negative masculinity. But what about the people who haven't been brought up in this environment? Is there anything we can do for them now, or are they all lost? I don't know.
Raewyn's probably got something to say about this too, but one of the things, there's a strong movement now, because I do a lot of sort of pro bono advocacy work around sexual assault and domestic violence, that sector, and working with very expert people in that sector. And the big movement now is secondary prevention. And indeed, the NRL, the National Rugby League, who I'm working with, we now have secondary prevention programs.
Meaning that somebody's done it, you don't want it to happen again.
Yeah, so that they've they may have engaged in domestic violence, for instance, and it's not about letting them off the hook for that.
Are there interventions that work?
Yes, there are. In fact, Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia's just done a lot of research in this area, and I think Australia's one of the leading countries in the world on secondary prevention. So I don't think we just give up at all, but I think the younger we can start, the better, because it's not only the women and children that lose out, of course they're the targets, it's also men who end up, losing their families, in jail, etc.
Zac, do you want to comment?
I'd be out of a job if there was nothing to do. I don't only see 5-year-old boys. And the thing is that the men from 20 to 80 that I see have an amount of flexibility, I guess. And it's a matter of really bringing that out of them and finding the opportunities for change within the rigidity of their lives. Because the older you get, the more rigid we become. But it's not, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
But the problem here, Raewyn, is individual therapy, and it's a good question, might work, and there are individual interventions, but we're talking about population-wide stuff. So we're talking about prevention, but there's population-wide intervention. Are there population-wide things that we can do which actually help to remedy the situation that's already there, rather than prevent the next generation from adopting these behaviours?
There certainly are. I mean, I have no doubt that patterns of masculinity and femininity are not fixed. They're not fixed by the genes. And they're not fixed by psychology, except in some extreme cases of mental disorder. There are always possibilities for change in human lives. When we're talking about society-wide patterns, we have to think about change at the society-wide level. So we have to think about income inequalities, for instance. We have to reckon with the scale, which is in fact usually underestimated. I mean, we think of the gender gap in income as something like 15 or 18%. But if you look at the superannuation figures, which are a much better indication of lifetime income, it's more like, women's super entitlements, something like 50 or 60% of men. So it's a matter of the scale of difficulty of moving things, rather than there being no possibility of moving things.
Microphone number 1.
Hi. I would say, now correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be an agreement on both sides that there is a lot of displays of masculinity, whether you'd say domestic violence or the corporate world or etc. I would say could you really say that you can chalk all of it up to genuine masculinity, or all of it up to like an insecurity and a need to seem masculine, or is it perhaps more of a case-by-case basis?
Good question. Systemic or individual? David?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. I don't think that someone who is whole or feels good about themselves, I mean, we all get anxious. We all go through all the vicissitudes of life. But someone who is healthy and strong in their masculinity doesn't silence a woman, doesn't micromanage a woman, doesn't stalk a woman, doesn't troll a woman, doesn't harass a woman, doesn't violate or mutilate or maim or rape. I mean, that can only come, I think, from a very corroded sense of what it means to be a man. So I think that is systemic. There's too many of them for it not to be systemic. So it's easy to point the finger at the Trumps or the Weinsteins or the Roger Ailes or the Bill O'Reillys or whoever it is. But in actual fact, it's systemic. And the system has created this behaviour, and that's what we have to try and unpack and hopefully change.
And I think our panel is in violent agreement with you. Thank you very much for that question. And I'm sorry to the other people who've been waiting for a while. We've run out of time on the questions, but thank you for standing so patiently for us. And now it's time for our debaters to summarize. They've got 2 minutes each, and we'll start in the same order. Zac, your 2 minutes begin now, and I'm going to get my stopwatch.
All right, so I think we've kind of cast this issue as an either-or rather than an and. Raewyn and Catharine have really fought very eloquently on behalf of the fact that there is so much power in masculinity. But I do not believe that there is only power without fragility. Masculinity is not a single way of being, and we're privileged to have Professor Connell here, who pioneered the idea of multiple masculinities and the idea that they're in constant flux. That, you know, there's privileged and powerful men all the way down to the most marginalized. But what is more fragile than the knowledge that should you come out as gay, wish to transition, or become disabled, for instance, you will fall down rungs of the ladder of masculinity. It's this uncertainty that leaves many men feeling powerless. And I would say that it is not true that men are powerless, but it is real to many of them. I see them every day, and they feel it to their very core. They feel powerless. The pain and suffering that's been inflicted upon women and children and men of colour and those from sexual minorities cannot be excused by the fact that it was just the fragility of men in power that made them do it. But it must be said that men's power that has subjugated these groups for centuries is what Freud would have labelled, had he been a feminist of course, the most widespread defence mechanism on display in our society. So if I was to summarise my day-to-day as a psychologist working with men, we need to navigate the disconnect between who they want to be and who they think they should be. Things are about to change. We're talking about masculinity. It's you know, a crazy phenomenon that we're now here at this forefront in society where we get to talk about it. We need to get them to seemingly bridge this gap between the public and private masculinity, so that when we ask men, what do you think society expects of you as a man, and what do you expect of yourself as a man, we'll start to get the same answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Zac. Raewyn.
Okay. I agree with the questioner who suggested that the issue of violence is hovering around most of the things we've been thinking about tonight. I would argue that it is actually dangerous to interpret men's violence against women as basically a product of the fragility in men's lives. I take a very different view of that matter. I think it is mainly a consequence of unequal power, like many other forms of violence. And there is research evidence for this, that domestic violence, for instance, is often associated, statistically associated, with ideologies of entitlement on the part of the men who perpetrate it, entitlement to dominant power in the household, and to ideologies insisting on rigid divisions between masculinity and femininity. Now, the dominant forms of masculinity, which are built on those kinds of notions of entitlement and rigid division, have been under challenge. We, I think, in arguing for the importance of the social level, of structural inequality, are not suggesting things are impossible to change, but the change has to happen at the systemic, at the social level. And it has been happening with the surfacing of gay masculinities, queer masculinities, alternative straight masculinities. These are important changes, and they can be moved ahead. I think in some ways they're moved ahead unintentionally, like the economic changes which have produced more economic insecurity, especially among young men, are undermining that familiar breadwinner model of masculinity, which has been so important in the past. Now, the consequences of that are dangerous, may be toxic, but there are possibilities of change even in the current economic order. And the things we have to do to move the changes in positive directions are not exotic. I mean, they're not strange. They are things like equalising things in the workplace, like moving towards not just equal pay, but equal income for men and women, providing equal access to other social resources. These are things within our capacity. We are not stuck in the current position. We never have been. Historical change is real, and we can it is possible that gender orders will move in more progressive directions at the moment, but it's a big ask. That is, I guess, what we have above all been arguing. It's a serious and difficult area of work, but one that's immensely important. Thank you.
Anyone who's worked down the coal mine of youth suicide, homelessness, mental health, juvenile justice, or the education system knows there is a crisis in masculinity, and they've known it for years. Boys' school retention rates lag well behind girls, literacy levels are lower, drug overdoses, road trauma, workplace fatalities, unemployment, and of course youth suicide. Men are living on average 6 years less than women, and in 4 out of 5 marriage breakdowns, they're the ones being left. Among boys and young men, there is more obesity, homelessness, schizophrenia, and attention deficit disorder than ever before. Young men are entering universities in fewer numbers. In schools, the majority of children with behavioural problems are boys. So too those with learning difficulties. The masks that boys and men are compelled to put on do terrible things to young men. They isolate even as they protect. Young men, we hear it all the time, they have mates but no true friends. They find it hard to talk to each other. And when they become adults, the women and children in their lives often talk about having no sense of connection. Either way, it's a dismal life. And it's no doubt, I believe, that the definitions of masculinity have sold boys and men a bill of goods, and that suicide, death by loneliness, takes young men's lives far more than young women's. That is the fragility at the heart of the models of manhood that we've been given. And these models of manhood create confused, broken, angry boys and men who are ready to inflict damage on themselves and others. And according to a recent Washington Post report, more likely because of a fragile masculinity, read erectile dysfunction and hair loss, to vote for a posturing male like Donald Trump. Now, I can't speak to the former condition, but I can obviously to the latter. And I'd just like to end this on this note. The two of us guys up here tonight have opened our hearts to you. And I really think the only way our vulnerability can be honoured is if we win.
Amen to that.
A cheap plea for sympathy based on his alopecia.
Oh.
Please welcome Catharine Lumby again.
Oh, David, boo-hoo. I'll get out my tiny violin for you. Poor powerless man. Look, I think a lot of important comments have been made on both sides of this debate, and some eloquent comments by speakers as well as questions. One thing I would submit to you is that the changes that feminists have been fighting for, the changes that people associated with the civil rights movement more broadly have been changing for, are ones which will benefit men, as you know, and I'm talking about straight white blokes who I was going on about, as much as all the other groups that are asking to be included. If we can live in a more diverse, more inclusive society, whether it's at the workplace level, whether it's in terms of who's raising children, whether it's in terms of who's promoted in our corporations, whether it's in fact who's visible in the media. I think that's a very important thing we haven't talked a lot about. Who's represented, whose voices are represented. But I think that a more inclusive society, and one that challenges the structurally dominant gendered nature of our society, will result ultimately in a better world for everybody. And it's only by moving towards inclusivity that I think we can arrive not just at whole men, but a more holistic society where everyone benefits. Thank you.
Now it's time to find out what you thought three-quarters of the way through. Rebecca, you got the results.
Oh.
Amazing effort counting all these votes in this short space of time. There's been a swing. We've gone down from 53% to 43% for believing that men are fragile, masculinity is fragile. Undecided has plummeted to 8%. And against the proposition, 49%. So you're split down the middle. Could you please join me in thanking our superb debaters? And the winning team who made a 21% turnaround. Well done.